choice that will define the future of a region that served as the cradle of civilization and a crucible of strife.
We begin our headlines tonight in Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Gulf states. A lion that was rescued from the abandoned zoo in Syria has given birth to a cub just hours after.
In the pursuit of a broader peace and peace with the Palestinians. And I greatly look forward to discussing this in detail with you, Mr. President.
Hi, my name is Gemma Neary and welcome to this week's edition of The Modern Middle East. Throughout the show we'll look at the different systems of government across the Middle East. We'll be joined by a former expat who worked in Qatar, and we'll finish with a feature travel story about a couple who hiked through Turkey. But first, let's look at what's been happening in the Middle East. We begin our headlines in Iraq tonight, where widespread civil unrest has left at least 11 people dead and dozens injured. Some protesters reportedly stormed government offices and set them on fire, driven by a growing sense of political disillusionment, compounded by frustrations over shortages of water, electricity, and employment opportunities. The ongoing demonstrations broke out in the country's south and spread to the capital of Baghdad, where a ballot recount is currently underway following a recent national election that's been plagued by accusations of fraud. At least 10 troops in Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps were fatally shot in an attack by unidentified gunmen that left a further 8 guards injured. Several of the attackers were also reportedly killed during the shootout, which occurred in a Kurdish region near the Iraq border. The area has previously experienced sporadic violence between Iranian forces and armed Kurdish opposition and Islamic State militants. However, the attack marked the largest number of Iranian troops killed in a single incident in recent years. Israeli lawmakers passed a controversial bill that grants Jewish citizens the exclusive right of self-determination in the country. The result sparked outrage in the Arab community amid fears that the measures will lead to the segregation of minorities and will reduce the chances of establishing an autonomous Palestinian state. The legislation comes with an escalation in the months-long conflict along the Israel-Gaza border. An Israeli soldier was shot and killed, the first Israeli fatality at the border in 4 years, and retaliatory airstrikes killed 3 Hamas militants, 1 civilian, and injured over 100 more. Russian-backed Syrian forces recaptured the province of Quneitra as part of the regime's campaign to regain control over the southwest of the country. Russian forces struck an agreement with opposition rebels to transport over 2,500 people who preferred not to remain under the control of the government to rebel-controlled territory in the country's north. The regime's military advances also resulted in a mass evacuation of over 800 White Helmets rescue workers to Jordan, where they will be resettled to Britain, Germany, and Canada in the coming months. Several bills passed through Egypt's parliament that have drawn criticisms as ways for President al-Sisi to censor free speech and consolidate power. The first defines a website or social media account with more than 5,000 followers as a media outlet, which would require the user to adhere to strict industry guidelines, while the second allows the president to grant immunity from investigation and prosecution to military officers that were involved in the overthrow of former President Morsi in 2013. President Xi Jinping of China met with the ruler of Dubai and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi as part of a 3-day trip to the United Arab Emirates. The two countries entered into a series of joint trade and business agreements, and the trip marked the first time in almost 30 years that a Chinese leader has personally visited the Gulf state. The meetings also coincided with an announcement from Dubai that the city plans to construct the world's largest Chinatown district, which will feature multiple retail and lifestyle attractions. A senior government official in Lebanon has endorsed plans to legalize the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. Many medical experts have researched the alleviating effect that cannabis can have on symptoms that are commonly associated with chronic illness, such as pain, muscle spasms, nausea, and anxiety. Cannabis is currently grown illegally in Lebanon, despite the country ranking the world's top 5 producers, and the recent assurances of the economy minister that their quality is one of the best in the world. Lastly, archaeologists in Jordan's Black Desert have discovered several remnants of flatbread that were baked over 14,400 years ago. The charred pieces were found in 2 fireplaces at a site believed to have been used by hunter and gatherer members of the ancient Natufian culture. The rare find has been hailed by historians as the first direct evidence that the production of bread preceded agricultural practices by more than 4,000 years. Let's move on now to the focus of this week's episode: the legitimacy of governments across the Middle East, from democracies to dictatorships and everything in between. Middle East analyst Frederick C. Hoff once defined political legitimacy as the decisive and near universal agreement by citizens on the rules of the political game within a given state. A political leader is viewed as legitimate if, through the eyes of their constituency, they have the moral and legal right to govern the state. This can be achieved through means such as elections, hereditary rule, ideological principles, or military coercion. A lack of legitimacy can often breed corruption, censorship, conflict, and widespread disenfranchisement, which can destabilize the structure of the state. Systems of government in the Middle East range from an authoritarian regime in Syria to a parliamentary democracy in Israel. In between is a theocratic republic in Iran, absolute monarchies in the Gulf, and presidential or parliamentary republics in Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. Then there are states such as Yemen, grappling with conflict and humanitarian emergencies, where the CIA simply classifies the government as in transition. However, the way that government systems are defined in theory is often quite different to what's actually practiced on the ground. Even states that share a similar system function differently across the region, depending on their specific social and political complexities. An absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia governs significantly differently than a parliamentary monarchy does in Jordan.
Those formalised aspects of political participation can be taken on by regimes that aren't really democratic. Electoral processes, parliaments, the implementation of constitutions, etc.
While the United Nations doesn't endorse one particular system of government, they do promote democratic governance as a set of values and principles that should be followed for greater participation, equality, security, and human development. These include a freedom of expression, an independent media, periodic and fair elections, a separation of powers, and a respect for human rights. While some argue that a state is either democratic or it isn't, others, such as the Economist Intelligence Unit, suggest that democracy can be measured on a spectrum. The British research company releases an annual index that ranks states on how democratic they are. Their analysis of 60 different indicators results in a score that falls into one of 4 classifications. The highest is full democracy, which describes a political culture that's independent, diverse, and flourishing, and only includes 20 countries in the 2017 index. Flawed democracy applies to countries who hold fair and competitive elections, but have a number of faults in areas such as media freedom and political participation. Israel falls into this category and is ranked 30th overall. Hybrid regimes are states that have shown significant weaknesses in the overall functioning of their government and judiciary, such as frequent corruption and election irregularities, which includes Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq. Authoritarian is the lowest classification and is designated to states that infringe on basic civilian rights, own or censor the media, and have little to no political pluralism. This applies to the majority of the Middle East, including Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, Iran, Yemen, and Syria, second last overall only to North Korea.
But it doesn't mean that in the absence of genuine elections, there's no political freedoms, or at least political participation. These two things exist in tension with each other, but they're not mutually exclusive.
From a population's perspective, the legitimacy of the government is not always determined by the number of democratic freedoms the state has. Absolute monarchs in the Gulf are able to maintain power and legitimacy partly because they can support the lifestyle of their populations, due to the surplus of wealth that's generated from exporting their large oil and natural gas supplies. In an unspoken agreement, civil benefits such as no taxation mean the majority of citizens won't openly demand greater accountability or diversity within political leadership. In contrast, tens of thousands of Iranians took to the streets in December 2017 to protest a range of economic issues including rising commodity prices, youth unemployment, and institutional corruption. In response to what was the largest anti-government demonstration in years, the regime censored media and internet access, and arrested thousands of peaceful protesters. To achieve and maintain political legitimacy, a state's governing systems depend on the consent of all factions of the population. With vast cultural traditions and regional complexities to consider, the established rules don't necessarily need to mirror what we're familiar with in the West. But if they can't be agreed upon, regimes will continue to corrupt the political game, consolidating power through means that only further disillusion its constituent players. We have to go to a break, but stick around as author Mikolai Napieralski joins us in the studio to discuss the 3 years he spent working as an expat in Qatar. Welcome back. Joining us in the studio is Mikolai Napieralski, an author and freelance copywriter who spent 3 years as the head of marketing and public relations for the Qatar Museums Authority, which inspired his recent book, God Willing, How to Survive Expat Life in Qatar. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on.
That's awesome. So firstly, tell us a bit about your career and how it took you to Qatar.
Well, my background, I guess, is in journalism and editorial work. So I was working in advertising, I was working as a freelance journalist, and I was in Melbourne, and so I was given the opportunity to go over to the Middle East. An old friend of mine was working over there. He came back to town, we got talking. I'd always wanted to see the Middle East, and so when I had the opportunity to go over there, I couldn't resist. So, yeah.
How would you describe social and political life in Qatar to someone who's never been there before?
Well, look, I mean, before I went over there, I thought it was going to be a very dry and dull experience. I was going to go there to do some work, save some money, work on some interesting projects, and come home.
Yeah.
But what I found was it was far more interesting than any of the guidebooks or any of that had actually explained. I mean, obviously there's a very vibrant culture there, a very old culture, but just in terms of expat life, it's a very strange culture of hotel bars and shopping malls and this kind of very different lifestyle that we have here to Australia. And so I guess the book talks about the fact that, it's not what it seems. It seems like a very conservative culture and lifestyle. And while there's certainly part of it, there's a lot more to it. And especially as a Western expat, there's an underbelly to all of that. And the book kind of talks about some of the excess and some of the kind of the lifestyle that goes alongside being an expat over there.
Yeah. So did you delve into the culture much, or did you stay strictly Western when you were there?
To be honest, I was very much the typical kind of horrible Western expat.
Yeah.
In that we went out to hotel bars, we lived this kind of life of excess, and so we would do things like you'd find yourself getting picked up in town cars to go to your hotel, to go for drinks on a Monday night, that kind of stuff like that, and that was expat life over there. I mean, that was the kind of expat lifestyle you could have over there. There's obviously other parts to that. So I mean, one of the more interesting experiences we had was going to the inland sea. So basically between Qatar and Saudi, there's like this inland sea. It's about 2 hours drive south of the capital. And there's only about 500 meters of water that separates two countries.
Wow.
And so on the Qatar side, you've got rolling dunes.
Yeah.
And on the Saudi side, you've got these kind of amazing mountains. And so you can drive down there, you can pitch your tents, and I guess on the Qatar side at least, you can start a bonfire and drink tequila and do all that kind of stuff like that. But the thought that there's very little that separates you from Saudi, where those kinds of things would be very much frowned upon and would get you in a whole lot of trouble. So there was this contrast between this kind of Western expat excess and the kind of more, I guess, localized things you could look into as well.
So what was it like working for the Museums Authority? Like, what did your job on a day-to-day basis entail?
So look, originally I was over there to work on, I guess, the communications and marketing side of things for exhibitions.
Yep.
And I guess what Qatar was trying to do was really establish its soft power. So what their kind of aim was to establish the country as a hub for the arts and for museums and for education. And so they were like pumping billions of dollars into all these museums. And so you'd have things like Damien Hirst and Takeshi Murakami and these kind of ridiculously lavish exhibitions you wouldn't be able to have elsewhere in the world. So my job, I guess, was to look after the communications side of things there. And eventually I ended up looking after marketing for the Orientalist Museum.
So I
was over there for 3 years working on these exhibitions. And what happened in the end was a lot of this was funded, obviously, on the price of oil and gas.
Yeah.
And so what happened was around 2015, the price of oil went from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel. And so all the money and the budgets allocated for these exhibitions disappeared. And so all of a sudden, we had 5 museums planned, and they were all going to be like these lavish billion-dollar type of exhibitions. That all dried up. That all disappeared. And this whole generation of expats who went over there to work in the arts sector found themselves basically at a desk with a job, but nothing to do. And so, so between 2012, 2015, museum professionals from around the world kind of gathered in Qatar, worked in these events, and they all kind of gradually disappeared around 2015.
Yeah.
And
So when you weren't working,
Yeah.
what else did you do in your spare time?
So I guess I had a close-knit group of friends over there. And that's the other thing about working in the Gulf, is that as opposed to, say, Melbourne or Brisbane or wherever, where you've got the same friends since high school,
Yeah.
Everyone over there is an expat. And so
Yeah.
no one knows everyone. And so it's super easy to meet people. And so it's great because you arrive in the country and, your friends from work will invite you out for drinks or whatever it might be. And you'll end up with this kind of, group of friends who always hangs out together, always goes out together. And so we had this kind of very close-knit expat community over there.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is so surreal, coming from a suburban Western background to
Yeah.
suddenly be living this kind of lifestyle over there.
That would be incredible, just
Yeah, it
walking
was.
into a community in a completely foreign place.
Which is actually lovely, and I guess that's one of the things too, is that you meet these amazing people,
Yeah.
and you try and stay in contact afterwards.
Oh,
But I guess
that's
a few
lovely.
places in the world, like if you go to, say, like New York or London, right, it's the same thing. Everyone's got their friends, everyone's got their networks,
Yeah.
and it's very hard to sort of have that community. Whereas places like Doha and Qatar in the Middle East, yes, have this kind of almost a group of friends you can pick up along the way. So yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that stands out, like any awesome experiences that you've had that you'd like to mention?
Look, there's a couple. I guess one of the stories I like telling my friends is we'd work on these amazing exhibitions, and one of the big ones was for Damien Hirst.
Yeah.
So he had like a big retrospective of his work, and so it's kind of lavish function, and some days I was helping to work on the marketing for it, and I look over, and I see this beautiful woman in the crowd, and I'm like, that looks like Naomi Campbell, but she's kind of shorter than you'd imagine Naomi Campbell to look like.
Yeah.
And one of my friends is like, oh, that actually is Naomi Campbell. I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough.
Oh, that's
And
a very
so
casual response.
you've got Damien Hirst, you've got Naomi Campbell, you've got these kind of random European aristocrats all gathering in Qatar for this exhibition. And we walk outside, and there's a helicopter that's going to take them all to a pop-up Prada shop in the desert for the after party.
Very lavish.
And so that was kind of stuff that would happen all the time. So like, oh, that's amazing. We weren't invited to the after party. We just had to watch the helicopter take off.
You have your expat friends. You can
Exactly,
hang out
yeah.
with them.
But so things like that. You
Yeah.
never see that in Australia.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And obviously, the budget for those kinds of excessive launches
Yeah.
just doesn't exist here. But yeah,
Lastly, would you work in the Middle East again?
it depends. Look, I went over there initially for a year was the
Yeah.
plan, and I ended up loving it. I had a great group of friends. We worked on some amazing projects, and so look, while the country was booming, and while they're investing all this money in museums, it was amazing. And I guess one of the reasons that I liked working over there was the fact that you did feel that you were contributing to something bigger.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a job. It was, okay, we are helping to build education and museum infrastructure in this country. And so that was really rewarding. And so I guess if there was a chance to do something along those lines again, then yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah? In Qatar again?
We'll see. I mean, I'm not sure how they feel about the book itself, so there may be some issues there, but I'd love to head back to some of the other regions, yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately we're running out of time, but going to have to go to a break. But thank you so much for coming on and
You're
sharing
welcome.
your experiences. You make me want to go to Qatar now.
You should definitely try.
God Willing, How to Survive the Expat Life is currently available online and in bookstores. When we get back, we'll share some tips from travelling couple about the best things to see, do and eat when in Turkey. Welcome back. A lot of the content that we cover throughout the show focuses on regional politics and conflict, But we also want to spend a bit of time exploring some of the beautiful destinations and unique experiences that the Middle East has to offer. So to wrap up tonight's episode, we spoke earlier with Mark and Sin, who are an American couple who quit their jobs to travel full-time, which included a recent stop in Turkey.
Yeah, it's 2 p.m. What time is it for you? Oh, thanks for waking up early.
I'm Mark.
And I'm Zin. So we're both born and raised in Singapore. We both moved to New York City and worked in finance. But earlier this year in February, we actually quit our jobs so that we could travel full time for a year. We spent about 8 days in Turkey, and then it's about 4 days in Jordan. We spent some time in Istanbul, and we went to visit Pamukkale, which is the cotton castles. We went to Ephesus, which is another ancient city, and also we visited Cappadocia. We specifically wanted to like explore and hike, do most of the hike. Some people go there to do the hot air balloons. We didn't actually ride the hot air balloons at all, but we did take great pictures of it. But we spent most of our time hiking through all the little towns and just exploring the different formations, and it was just incredible.
Yeah, we're big hikers in general, so Cappadocia was like magical for us, just going trail after trail. Favorite food we had was probably the balik ekmek. It's like it's basically fish sandwich, but what it really was like a grilled mackerel. There was like one guy who was grilling the mackerel for like hours. We waited for like an hour for hours. But it was totally worth it. It was in like a little burrito with, very heavily spiced, super tasty, super fresh. Mm-hmm. And then probably the coffee, traditional Turkish coffee. Watching it getting steeped over, the traditional way, like over hot sand. It just starts to get all these air bubbles and it aerates and gains so much in volume. It was an experience watching it and just drinking it. It was like super creamy, but there's obviously like no dairy involved. That was super good coffee.
Yeah. One thing I would add is initially, before I went, I wasn't sure how, as a woman, how I should be dressed in those countries, just because, the majority of the country is Muslim, so they're more conservatively dressed, and whether I wasn't sure if I had to wear a hijab, or the hit scarf, but it turns out that you don't actually have to, wear a hijab, but unless you're visiting a mosque, you don't have to cover yourself up that much. But then it's always, I feel like even being there, dressing conservatively is definitely a good idea. One thing I would add actually about Turkey is it seems like it's one of the more well-traveled places in the Middle East. So for some people that may be more comfortable traveling to places where they can meet other fellow travelers, Turkey is a great option.
I would just say that the people in the Middle East in general were very welcoming. Mm-hmm. Everyone told us, feel home, feel at home. It's got a very rich, sort of distinct identity. So many like ancient civilizations originated in the area. So much history and culture, and we just wanted to, experience something different.
Thank you so much to Mark and Zin for sharing their experience. Check out the website below for more information on travelling in Turkey. That's the end of this week's edition. Share your thoughts on anything we've covered on our social media pages, and head to our YouTube channel to catch up on highlights from tonight and previous episodes. Tune in next week when we break down the tangled alliance politics of the Middle East. I'm Gemma Neary. Thanks for watching and have a great night.